Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about this stuff, big stuff, faith, politics, big ideas in our culture, with all kinds of really interesting, accomplished people of goodwill in good faith. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have and you really like what we do, please tell somebody about it. Give us a rating, leave a review. Those are good ways to help us continue doing what we're doing. The easiest way to find us, as you know, is our main site, which is real easy, politicsandreligion.us. That's www.politicsandreligion.us, because it's about all of us. And that helps get the word out so more people can participate in a conversation like the one we're having today with Philip Bump. Philip Bump is a national columnist for the Washington Post. Before that, he led political coverage for the Atlantic Wire, one of the paper's most read writers. He focuses on the data behind polls and political rhetoric. He has been on most major media outlets, from MSNBC's Morning Joe to Fox News' Special Report, and on NPR and PBS. His first book, The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom and the Future of Power in America, which we'll be talking a lot about today, looks at the overlap of the end of the baby boom and the upheaval in American politics and the U.S. economy. Philip Bump, thank you for joining us. How you doing?
It's my pleasure. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing great. Great. Although you did write the last column of the multiple columns you wrote today was about what I'm under here in California. So
the deluge. Yeah, that's actually I wrote one after that about COVID. So we don't feel too bad. There's another new one for you to check out there.
Oh, terrific. That was one of my questions, actually. You are one of the most prolific writers on a daily basis. How are you able to keep up? Like, how are you able to hold so many thoughts on and dive so deeply on so many different issues on a daily basis? Sometimes you're coming out with 4 or more a day.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a pat answer to that, right? I'm interested in a lot of different things. I've been doing this a long time. I've been at the Post alone for my 9th year now. But I also am just, I tend to look at things through a data lens, and I tend to understand and be able to parse data easily. And so, when most of the context for a piece is the numbers that undergird it, and you're good at coming up with those numbers, then that obviously makes it quicker too. So I don't know. It's something I'm fairly adept at, and I happen to. This is one of those things where, had I been living in 1850, I'd have been totally screwed, and had no idea how to run a farm, and been living subsistence, just try to scrounge for food. Luckily, I happen to be in an era when my skills match. So
yeah. So that leads to another question I had about charts. I mean, I would imagine that whether it's a chart that you're developing yourself or someone else's really cool chart, you look at it and then it spurs a number of questions. Is that maybe one of your inspirations for some of the subjects that you write about?
Yeah, actually, the COVID chart, the story that I just mentioned, was based on a chart I saw this morning that looked at the number of people who are missing work each month over the course of the past several years. And there's been a jump, as one would expect during the pandemic era. There more people now are missing work on a regular basis each month, but it hasn't waned. It's not as though there was this surge in early 2020 and then it fell back down. It's been consistent. It's at a higher level essentially than even a bad flu month. So I saw that chart. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. And it tells us a lot about COVID. It tells us a lot about politics. It tells us a lot about workplace culture. It's easy to replicate. I know where the data are for it, which is another advantage I have. I know where, I've been doing this long enough. I know where the government hides all of its data. And so that was something that's inspired me to be like, okay, let's look at this a little deeper. Then that became a story. So yeah, I mean, it's that's how I think. I have for a long time, the work that I've done has been centered on data and data analysis. And that's just how my brain works. So it works well.
Now, I did notice that you went to, or I was going to say Ohio State, but the Ohio State University, but you studied philosophy there, right?
Yeah.
Did you minor in statistics or something, or how did you first fall in love with charts and develop the skill
Sure.
of making them? I mean, it's a real skill.
Yeah, no, it's the through line there is logic.
Okay.
One of the things I like most about philosophy were the logical discussions. I mean, I like philosophy because it provides you a framework for thinking about how to think about things, right? And it's hard not to talk about the philosophy without sounding either pretentious or corny. But I like philosophy because it applies a rigor to how you think of things that obviously is very useful in my current job to consider rigorously the things that we're presented with in politics and culture. But then the logic aspect of it, which is just it is functionally equivalent to how you, for example, do computer programming, which is also something that I do. Just thinking through what it means when two things and or and the comparison between them. And logic has a very formal structure which is applicable in philosophy, but it's also applicable in math. It's applicable in things like computer programming. And so a lot of the work that I ended up doing was very logical in the context of data. And then the work that I do at the Post is both that and logical in the sense of breaking down rhetoric and arguments and understanding them better. And so the through line to all of that is logic, and logic being a subset of the philosophy that I study. My minor, by the way, is history, for what it's worth.
Oh, okay. So it's interesting because I'm thinking of one of the fascinating aspects of Albert Einstein is he was able to think about the most complex ideas, the most complex equations, distill them down to understandable pictures, so that when we read his work, the average guy who has a little bit of understanding in physics might be able to understand it based on those illustrations. I'm curious is that the way you think? You think about data and then you distill it and come up with visual ways of expressing it? Or what's your process to come up with, how do you come up with so many great charts?
Yeah, you're ascribing an intentionality that I can't say that I have, right? It's just sort of is intuitive. I will say, absolutely, I always compare myself to Einstein, so I'm glad that was fine. That's the first place I go, generally speaking. No, but I mean, for example, I worked at Adobe Systems, which is they make Adobe Acrobat, PDF, they make Photoshop, things along those lines. And my job there, I was a designer, but I was an instructional designer. Part of my job at Adobe was to teach people how to use these products. So I got very good at the products, which made it very easy for me to make graphs in Adobe Illustrator and so on and so forth. But it also helped me reinforce my ability to show people how to do things, right? And it turned out I was good at that. I came to Adobe. I didn't have a background in design. I hadn't gone to design school, but I ended up as a designer at Adobe because I knew how to do this. I knew how to explain these things to people. And at the same time, make aesthetically sufficient, I won't say gorgeous, but it says aesthetically sufficient art to go along with it. And so I've been doing that for a long time. So for example, I used to work with City Year, which is an AmeriCorps program, and I go into schools and help teach kids how to read and things along those lines. So there's also this instructional aspect to it as well, which is useful. So, for example, when Robert Mueller drops an indictment that's very complicated, has all these pieces, one of the things I'm good at is reading it, parsing it, and being able to present it to people in words, obviously not in a chart in that example, but I'm also good at coming up with a chart that can represent a bunch of data well and pick out the thing that's interesting about a data set and show that, using a scatter plot or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. It's a good point. Like, you can also sort of go in reverse. You picked out a story. I forget if it was today or yesterday. There was this conflict between a newly elected congresswoman in Florida and a writer for MSNBC. And you were able to sort of weed through the generic political, talking points and say, there's actually an interesting argument here. There's an interesting, there's some interesting information to cull through here.
No, I mean, that one, honestly, the argument I was making aligned entirely with the book, which is coming out shortly. And so it's just like, I am seeing the world very much through the lens of the book, just because I've been spending so much time thinking about it. And so that particular thing was about race and racial representation and the overlap with politics. And so while it was, this very hackneyed, dull, like, oh, the media attacked me because blah, 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 blah sort of story on the surface, the subtext to it was these issues of race and politics, which I think are very interesting.
Yeah, interesting and certainly worth exploring if you can have the discernment to see through the fodder, if you will.
Yeah.
I have noticed that your columns and other writing definitely reflect a point of view, albeit one that is nuanced, with a compass, for lack of a better word. It points towards certain principles, but you're not, I wouldn't say that you're partisan. So how would you describe the most important principles that guide you, whether it's the way you view politics or culture more broadly?
I think that justice and honesty are very important, right? I think it is important to be fair, and I think it's important to be straightforward. And I get into a lot of trouble from both people on the left and on the right when I break down bad arguments and reveal them to be bad, right? But I've been thinking a lot about this. When I was in middle school or high school, a teacher told my mother that she had noticed that I had a very, very little patience for people who were not very bright. And I don't say that as a matter of pride. I mean, you can see me being an obnoxious little jerk in 8th grade and like mocking, like, who knows how that manifested in the way that the teacher said she would, mention to my mother. But I find that that's actually a very useful instinct for me in the moment, because it gets me very mad at people who, for example, make obviously false claims about election fraud in 2020. It makes me mad. And I have energy to be like, here are all the reasons. It powers my interest in breaking these things down, right? And that again is, it is about responding to stupidity, but it's also about being honest and being fair and and treating something accurately and honestly, which obviously is what all journalists try and do, but I think is one of the core principles that I have there.
Do you find that approach is equipping folks who generally agree with some of those concerns, or is it also persuasive of those who are also enthralled with, elect the election deniers, for example?
Well, I mean, this is a fundamental question for a media in this moment, which is, do we have any effects, right? Are we getting through to people who have had this very, very robust effort to treat us as the dishonest parties, to treat us as the biased parties? When all of our work is behind a paywall and people aren't going to pay to read it, and even if they were free, they don't read it most of the time because they get takedowns of what we're writing on Breitbart and these other websites. Are we able to actually make a dent? And I have to say that the answer to that is often no. That I can write a lot of takedowns of bad arguments and so on and so forth, and they're never seen. And even if I were to print them out and hand them to someone and say, "Look, read this. What you're saying is not accurate. I can show it to you. Read this document." They'll throw it in the trash. Be like, you work for the Washington Compost, right? I mean, it's I say that as a sort of a joke, but it's a real problem, and it's a fundamental reason that we have the divide in the culture that we have.
Yeah, it seems like we can't even agree on facts, the right. idea of alternative facts, if you will. That points to something you expressed at the very end of the book. You express a hope at the end of the acknowledgments, and speaking of your kids, that this book was something you did to make their lives better. Right. The after. So we're talking about the aftermath. Again, it's the aftermath, the last days of the baby boom and the future of power in America. So how are you hoping that this work would make lives of future generations better?
I didn't know anyone read the acknowledgments, so I was not expecting that question. Yeah, I mean, the book's dedicated to my kids, and part of what I try and do in my job and in my life is reflect to them how I think life ought to be lived, right? Which I think is probably what all parents do. But really, the reason I included that at the end of the acknowledgments and saying essentially that hopefully they'll look back on the book and see it as something of value was really just sort of a mark of the fact that they are very young and we're only sort of semi-cognizant of the fact that I'm writing a book. My elder son, who is now 6, was when I told him the book was almost finished, he asked if the one thing I had to do was go back and add the pictures. That's right. But and of course there are a lot of pictures that happen to be charts, but yeah, no, I mean, the book is not intended to be a seminal work that reshapes American society, but it is instead to sort of help us understand why things are happening. And I think the lens of the book, which is that there are a lot of tensions in American society which are born of the sharp differences between older and younger Americans, differences that extend well beyond age. I think that recognizing that and using some of the examples from the book about how better to ameliorate those differences, I think it can be beneficial. I don't think it's going to upend, I don't think that America's rift will be healed when everyone buys a copy of the Aftermath and reads it. But I think, I think that it is both a fair, accurate, and comprehensive assessment of where America is in the moment, but also, an optimistic / realistic one.
So going a generation behind, it so happens, I think you describe yourself as a Gen Xer. I am right smack in the middle. I was born in 71. My mother happens to be exactly 1 year and 1 day younger than Kathleen Casey Kirschling. I think that's how you say her last name.
That is, yeah.
Are your parents boomers?
They're boomers. Yeah, 48, both of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we're right about in the same range. Both my parents were 1947. So was that part of your fascination with this generation, or is it just the significance of the impact the baby boomer generation has had on our culture?
Yeah, I mean, no disrespect to my parents, but no, that was not a factor. Right? No, I mean, it really is just, I've been fascinated by generations for some time. It probably started, I'd say maybe 2014 or so, back when I was working for the Atlantic Wire. I did a piece then sort of assessing. There was, every couple of months or years, there emerges one of these little brouhahas about who's in what generation, so on and so forth, right? And so one occurred at that point in time, and so I decided to poke around, which is, again, this is what I do. I like, there's a question, I want to get the answer to that question, then I try and do it and visualize it. So I made a chart for the Atlantic that used the then best available and most broadly accepted definitions of what the generations were. I talked to people at the Census Bureau, and one of the things that they commented to me at that time was that the only generation the Census Bureau recognizes is the baby boom. And the reason why is because it has sharp demographic markers. You can see, and there are charts in the book that show this, you can see when in 1946, all of a sudden the number of births just skyrockets, and it stays high until, essentially the mid 1960s, which it comes back down. And so the millennials also a big generation, but they don't have those same markers. They are not as distinctive demographically as the baby boomers. And so that at the time, the fact that the baby boomers were so large that they were the only definable generation, essentially, by the standards of the U.S. Census Bureau, that stuck with me. And then as I started to research the book and learned about the actual sheer size of the boom, which, I couldn't even fathom coming into it, that obviously drove a lot of what the rest of the copy in the book.
Yeah. One of the bits of trivia that I found fascinating that I kind of knew generally, but seeing it and seeing you kind of expound upon it is that 3 of our most recent presidents were born within 66 days. Now, technically, Donald Trump was born just before that actual spike. But yeah, what significance could you draw out a little bit of the significance and whether you think those 3 presidents, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, all born within 66 days of each other, what significance that holds and whether they represent the generation well?
Yeah, no, it is a fascinating little aspect of American history. So yeah, basically from June to August 1946, the baby boom started. That's off the top of my head, I believe that's right. The baby boom essentially started right in the middle of 1946, according to demographers. We generally consider 1946 broadly to be the start of the baby boom generation. The woman to whom you referred earlier, Kathleen Casey Kirschling, who is considered the first boomer, was born at the stroke of midnight in 1946. So technically, she was pre-boom according to the demographers, but we use her just as the standard. So anyway, all of that. Here's the problem: when you write a book on a thing, then you have 85,000 different footnotes you have to inject into every conversation. Anyway, yeah, it's fascinating to consider that those 3 presidents, very, very different people and very, very different presidencies, very, very different politics, were all born in that 2-month span. So you have Donald Trump being born, then you have George W. Bush being born, you have Bill Clinton being born, all within 2 months over the course of the summer of 1946. Donald Trump, of course, born into wealth, born into a certain status, not the status that he would eventually gain, but and not the oldest child either, which is unusual. For a lot of kids that were born in 1946 were the first kids. That's the whole point, right? Ostensibly, the sort of the mythology goes that the soldiers came back from the war and had kids, and these are often the first kids. And so one of the people who's written about Donald Trump, Gwenda Blair, she noted that he sort of had the style of a firstborn kid, He was sort of like, he assumed he was the sort of the king of the world sort of vibe that you get from firstborns. And so, but very different than George W. Bush, who was born into a very real and established, dynasty in America. He had was his uncle or his great uncle who was a U.S. senator. Obviously, his father was a senior government official, went on to become president. He himself became president. They had money. He grew up, he was born in Connecticut, which people tend to forget. And then you have Bill Clinton, who was abandoned essentially by his father, was raised by his grandparents in Arkansas, and sort of worked his way out from there. Clinton, of course, becomes a Democrat. George W. Bush becomes an establishment Republican. Donald Trump becomes a right-wing populist Republican, right? And so you can see sort of the life circumstances that led each of them to their final place in American history. But you also see how they represent different poles from within the baby boom itself. And it's also worth noting that they represent the baby boom because they are white men who share certain characteristics. And, the baby boom is very, very heavily white. And that is one of the core differences between it and younger Americans, which again is the central part of the book.
Yeah. So pulling the lens out a little bit, how big is the baby boomer generation as a share of the U.S. population? But also, how might you quantify boomers' share of power and wealth in the country?
Sure. So I'm afraid I'm not able to recite the statistics off the top of my head. But essentially, one way to think about the size of the baby boom is there are about as many in 1946, if you took the population in 1946, over the course of the next 19 years, the period of the baby boom itself, there were basically the number of babies born was greater than half of the size of the entire population of the United States in 1946. Right. So it would be as right now there's 330 million people living in the United States. It would be as if 115 million people were born in the next 2 decades in the United States. Right. Yeah. Which is insane to think about. Like, of course, like that's insane. Another way to think about it is the baby boom is the millennial generation as defined by Pew Research Center, because it's not technically a demographic generation. But the millennial generation is almost the same size as the baby boom.
In terms of actual people.
In terms of count, exactly, right. But not percentage of the population. That's exactly right. And so the baby boomers were so many people that were born into this relatively small American population that the same group of people, is about the same size of a generation, these millennials, were also born into the United States, but by then the United States had become this massive, huge population. And so the millennials didn't have the same percentage impact on the country as the baby boom. And I forgot the second part of your question. But
that's okay. Sorry. I tend to do that. I think in conjunctions. So sure. The second part is so we have a sense of the number and percentage of people the baby boomers make up currently.
Power. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, power and wealth. They have an outsized influence in terms of power and wealth, don't they?
Yeah, but I mean, consider that they always did, right? And this is one of the introductory points of the book, which is that no one can understand what life was like before the baby boom. There are very, very few people who are alive today who were, cognizant of the United States prior to the baby boom. Everyone else was either a member of the baby boom or came after it. And so we tend to underestimate or understand, which is to coin a new word there, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The scale of the effect that it had. So you have, again, this population increase of 50% of the entire population being born over those 2 decades, at a period right after the World War II, when the economy is booming. And the analogy that's often used is of a snake swallowing a pig.
Yeah.
Right. And that, first the snake has to unhinge its jaw and the pig starts working its way in. And then as it moves through the body, the snake's body gets very, very wide. And then it, as the pig passes through, it gets very, very narrow. And so we saw this with the American economy, and we see it with American power. We see that as the baby boom, when they were babies, all of a sudden, a massive boom in baby-related businesses. Diapers, diapers, shoe bronzing, right? All these different things. And then they get older, and then all of a sudden there isn't as much demand for those, right? And so, the diaper industry, is no longer experiencing those boom times. Of course, it took, the baby boom lasted for 2 decades, so they've been okay for a while. But then you get to, you got to start building all these schools. Los Angeles County, over the course of the years of the baby boom, is averaging 1 new school every single month. That's just in Los Angeles, right? And that's a period of 19 years. Yeah. Then you get into the workforce. All of a sudden, there are all these people that need to find jobs. And so a lot more people start going to college. That happens right when Vietnam is emerging, right? So a lot of these people get drafted and sent to Vietnam. Then you get into power itself, the halls of Congress, right? And you can actually see, if you look at the average age of legislators, you can see this downward shift as all of a sudden the baby boomers, who of course agitated to be able to vote at a younger age and were able to successfully get a constitutional amendment that allowed them to do that, start electing people more in their age group. Bill Clinton, the best example of that, right? He's the first baby boomer president, elected at a very young age, as were all these other boomers. But now we're getting to the point where they're all retiring and all the boomers are older. And so all of these patterns that happened are now happening with older people. And at the same time, the baby boomers broadly, generationally, have accrued a lot of wealth. They own homes. They have all this power, both in business and in politics. And there is now a large group of younger people who is coming up behind them and saying, hey, wait a minute, what about our share? But the baby boom is so large, and it's not that it acts, cohesively as a generation. It's not like everyone in it shares the same politics and economics and so on and so forth. But there is this instantiated power within this group of people that lingers in a way that past generations haven't, simply by virtue of that same ongoing pig in the python scale.
Yeah. You brought up so many interesting points about not only the history of the baby boom generation, but also starting to project out forward. And one of the things that you point out, I don't have the exact note in front of me, but one of the things, it's the first time that I've seen this note in terms of don't worry too much about it. And that is the Social Security Trust Fund.
Yeah.
A lot of folks are saying, hey, the house is on fire, guys. This is going to run out pretty soon. I think 2030 is the year or thereabouts. And you made an argument in the book, or cited some arguments in the book for like, nah, it's kind of the way it's supposed to go. Right. So can you remind me or share with our listeners how that argument goes?
Yeah. So essentially, the baby boom occurs right after the New Deal, right? And so there are all these government programs that are put in place, as a response to the Depression in the wake of World War II, essentially, and prior to World War II, during the Roosevelt administration, it instantiates all of these different programs that are designed to provide for security for individuals in various ways. So Social Security is created. And the idea of Social Security is you work over the course of your life, you put it into the Social Security fund, and then when you're ready to retire, you draw down from the Social Security fund, right? And it's supposed to be, the idea, I guess, theoretically, is that it is a wash over the course of your life. You put it in and you get the money out, right? That's not really how it works for a lot of reasons. People die earlier, people live longer. There are all these ways in which the actual percentages are shifted. But the idea now, consider that the baby boom started in 1946. As we talk, it is the year 2023, right? So what does that mean? That means that over the oldest baby boomers are now 77. The youngest baby boomers are about 2 decades younger than that. And so we're right in the middle of baby boomers retiring. We're right in the middle of baby boomers starting to draw down on that money. So we had this huge, again, think of the pig and the python. We had this huge group of people who are entering the workforce, paying the Social Security, adding all this money. And so the size of the Social Security Trust Fund, and there's several funds, but to use it collectively, balloons. There's all this money that's put into it. And now we're at the part where it's starting to be drawn down on, right? Which is the way that it's supposed to work. And so I talked to Monique Morrissey from the Economic Policy Institute. She's not a hard right Republican. That's not what EPI is. But this was her point. Her point was, yes, this is what's supposed to be happening now. It's supposed to be going down. Now, granted, we don't want it to go to zero. And there are a lot of challenges that are emerging in part because Americans are living longer, or at least they were, prior to the pandemic. Life expectancies have dropped since then, but people generally are living longer. That the retirement, it's sort of hard to say what retirement looks like. So there are a lot of asterisks and factors that play into the solvency of this fund, but it is designed to be depleted. It is designed for this big pool of money to go downward. That doesn't mean that there may not have to be adjustments, that people may end up getting less than they had expected. That certainly could be in the forecast. But to worry about it being drawn down at a time when the biggest population, the biggest percentage-wise generation in American history is now reaching retirement age, like that's how the system is supposed to work.
Yeah, I love how you describe not just this factor, but other factors, both historically and kind of trying to project out to the degree that we can. You said at one point over and over, age-dependent systems struggle to accommodate the encroaching boomers. And as you say, it's like America has been a nation of Lucille balls scrambling to handle the conveyor belt of chocolates. But I did...
which I point out is something that only boomers and Gen Xers are actually going to understand the reference, but that's fine.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very boomer-esque reference.
It is.
So in addition to simply being older than Gen Xers, and you talked about a little bit about this, older than Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Z, what are some of the other demographic differences that distinguish boomers?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental one, as I mentioned earlier, is race, right? So we have the baby boomers were born at a moment when immigration was curtailed by law in the United States. There was a big backlash against immigration about a century ago. There were immigration laws on the books that depleted the number of people who were coming to the country. As one sociologist who I spoke with pointed out, that by the time the boom began, the average immigrant was somebody's grandparent. These were old world people that came over from Italy or Ireland, and they were in their 60s and 70s, and most Americans, particularly during the boom when there are all these babies being born, there was very, very low density of immigrants. Then in the late 1960s, immigration laws are loosened. And so we start seeing this big surge of immigrants, not only from Mexico and Central America, but also from Asia and other parts of the world, Africa as well. And America starts becoming more diverse. And so we start seeing particularly younger people immigrate to the United States, people of childbearing age, and they start having kids. And so we see these populations of non-white Americans and U.S. residents start to blossom and grow very quickly. And of course, the kids that are born in America become Americans. And so suddenly we see that this very, very heavily white generation, the baby boomers, although the fascinating thing about the baby boom is even after the boom ended, right? The boom ends in 1964, but the population still continues to grow because of immigrants. So we have these people who were born outside the United States during the baby boom years who count as baby boomers. And those people are more heavily non-white, primarily Hispanic. And so the baby boom actually, after the boom was over, both got bigger and less white by virtue of these immigration changes. But we also see that younger generations in the United States tend to be more heavily Black and Hispanic and Asian and, mixed race in particular than were the baby boom. And so we have this difference between the baby boom and younger America. So when we talk about, the boomers look in America and America doesn't look like them anymore, it's literal, right? There are a lot of people who aren't white in America now. Under the age of 18, about half of the people in America who are under the age of 18 are non-white. And so race is a big one. Then you have these other factors, cultural and social factors, education. Baby boomers were much better educated than their parents, but that trend continued. And so younger people are much, much better educated than our baby boomers. Institutions, right? Religion. Right. Younger Americans are much less religious than older Americans. The baby boomers, again, these are trends that were, these are continuations of trends. You have the book, Bowling Alone, which is a very classic assessment of Americans sort of walking away from institutions. But that trend continued. So millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zers are much, much less religious than were baby boomers. And so there is, we get all these divides on things that have overlap with economics and have overlap with politics, like education or like religion, that differentiate the boomers from younger Americans and that contribute to the tensions that we see between the generations.
Yeah. So speaking of politics, I love how you ask a really succinct question in the book. You say, how much of the overlap between older voters and the GOP is a function of the racial demography of that older group, and how much a function of the fact that they're older? So how would you answer that?
Well, I would hedge because those things are hard to disentangle. But the entire point is that they're hard to disentangle, right? So when we talk about, we have this assumption, and people with whom I spoke pointed out that this is, one of the things you get when you start here, I'm going down a cascade of footnotes here again, but one of the things that you start to realize when you look at even just recent history in the United States is we don't really have good social data going back prior to like 1970, right? We don't have great polling. We don't have great, we don't have reliable research. There's just not a lot. And so really the history of the United States and our ability to really parse it in detail is only about 50 years old, a little older than that potentially, right? And, I'm giving short shrift to all sorts of people who came before that time, but you understand the point that these things are a lot of it too is just sort of buried in old tomes and dusty libraries and college campuses, and so it's not even accessible to most people. So that said, it means that it is hard for us to understand whether hoary old assumptions like that people tend to get more conservative as they get older, whether that generally held. And without polling, there's not even a good way to measure that. Like, what does it mean to be more conservative when you're, in say 1915, right? Like, what does it mean to be more conservative then? Is that comparable to how we understand conservative now, right? So we have these assumptions. Younger people get more conservative as they get older, but the people with whom I spoke said, well, that's not necessarily the case. And now in this moment, because we see that youth is confounded with race, right? That it is inextricable that people who are younger are less white. It's very hard to say, why is there this political difference between older and younger? Is it just the standard difference between older and younger in terms of, that older people are more conservative, younger people are more liberal? Or is it because these younger people are more likely to be Hispanic and Black and Asian, who are groups who tend to vote more heavily Democratic? Or is it because they are people who care about issues that weren't salient to older generations, like climate change or LGBTQ rights, right? Those weren't things that baby boomers paid attention to. They're very important to younger Americans. Is that part of what drives them to be more democratic? How does that overlap with race, right? So it's hard to disentangle all of this, but the entire point is that this generation, the boom generation, I'm doing hand gestures, which is really useful on a podcast, but that this older generation of the boomers, it just has very different characteristics than younger generations. And so we recognize that there are broad political differences, but it's hard to ascribe those differences to one particular set of dynamics.
I just had a random thought. One aspect that you don't deal with as much is where different people of different age ranges, different generations are getting their information. And frankly, I'm wondering if my kids' age are going to be more discerning about how to assess the information that they're getting. So number one, it's like where my kids get their information and their news sources is very different than where my parents are getting it. Right. But number two is, as we move forward, are kids in their 20s now and getting into their 30s going to be better at calling bullshit, basically?
Yeah. So I do mention that briefly. Part of the challenge is that these tools like social media, TikTok, things like that are so new that there's not a whole lot of research on them. I have seen studies actually suggesting both that younger people are more discriminating in terms of the information they consume and that they aren't. I tend to believe, and I've seen more studies that suggest they are more discriminating because they sort of were born into this universe of nonsense and sort of had to feel their way through it in a way that older generations didn't. I think everyone knows that the main sources of information are going to continue to be podcasts, newspapers, and books. I think we can all agree to that. That's true. But no, you look at something like cable news, right? Young people don't watch cable news, and cable news is a source of information to a lot of people. It is particularly a source of bad information on the political right in a lot of ways. There also is and has for a long time been a marketplace for misinformation and false claims that are tailored to the political right that we saw very clearly during the Tea Party era, that we saw in 2016. And that is a challenge. And though that tends to correlate because older Americans tend to be more conservative, there is, again, this sort of, it's this confounding between age and politics, and what is it that actually makes them more potentially more susceptible to or more likely to share false information, things along those lines. And it's just we're just sort of early. Like, Facebook has not been around very long, and so I don't know that we have a lot of good research on the long-term effects of people's ability to differentiate good information and bad on social media as a result.
Another stat that you cited, staying with politics, that I wanted to reflect on, it's a little bit of a sidebar, but really important. You mentioned that 4 in 10 Trump voters had no friends who were supporting Biden, and 4 in 10 Biden voters had no friends backing Trump. So number one, why is that? And number two, what are some of the ways we see that fact playing out in our I mean, it's a political point, but what are some of the other ways that we see it playing out in our politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the primary reasons that occurs is that people just don't live near or socialize with people who are different than them.
So geographic sorting.
Geographic, absolutely, but also just cultural, right? And, I mean, young people hang out with young people, right? Right? Old people hang out with old people, even in places where there may be, like take a college town in Oklahoma, right? And so, in the town itself, you got all the college kids and they're mixing in, with older people who may be more conservative and more rural. But it's not like they're hanging out together, not, sitting down and having dinner and having coffee. And so we have these other barriers. And because we do see that older Americans are more conservative and younger Americans are more democratic, I think that plays a role too. But I really think that this is one of the reasons, for example, that we saw Donald Trump's false claims about the 2020 election really take root. If you are someone who lives in an area where you are skeptical of big cities, and it's very easy to sound patronizing here, and I don't mean to. And so forgive me if I do. I don't intend to. But
for the record, you grew up in Western New York, so not really.
I grew up in Rochester, so it's not.
Okay.
It wasn't really. Honestly, when I went to high school, I lived in a small town in Northeast Ohio outside of Youngstown. So that's probably more now this year.
Yeah.
Those are better bona fides for this particular conversation. If you are someone who lives in, say, a rural area of Wisconsin, and you're just sort of skeptical of Milwaukee, or you see on Fox News that these cities are these hellholes of socialism and everything's being burned down by BLM, and you don't have firsthand experience of that, and you believe that to be true, and you don't understand how they're doing it. And then all of a sudden you see that Donald Trump lost Wisconsin because Milwaukee suddenly came with all these votes. Yeah, of course they did, right? And then you don't know anyone. Mark Fincham, this guy who ran for Secretary of State in Arizona,
right.
He very famously said that he doesn't believe Biden, one, because he doesn't know anyone to vote for Biden. Yeah, he doesn't. I'm sure he doesn't know anyone to vote for Biden, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem. If you don't know anyone to vote for Biden, if you're skeptical of the big cities, if you're being told that the Democrats are cheating and that cities are these hubs of fraud, it's very easy then to believe, of course the election was stolen. You're not going to be able to convince me otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the ways in which that manifests.
Yeah, to your point, I've shared this before, but it just happened just recently within the last month or so. I do make an effort to talk to folks that have very different views than me. I tend to be more centrist, independent. So I get a little bit more of a chance to read. It doesn't take me that far to reach, to someone to the right of me or to the left of me. So, but yeah, one conversation, I was talking to someone who is absolutely convinced that the election was stolen. And her response, one of the first responses she gave me was, well, I don't know anyone who voted for Biden, let alone 81 million people. Yeah. It was as if she was, listening to a Carrie Lake speech and just regurgitating it. But this is a very nice woman, and someone who's very earnest in believing that. So, right. But it occurred to me in reading your book, it helped me understand, that doesn't make sense. That her circle of friends sure. Likely is more homogenous than my own. I don't know. Right. Not trying to put myself on a pedestal to use your phrase.
No, I get it. Yeah, there are a lot of places in America where most of the people, and I got actual precinct level data. So the election results can be broken down to precinct level. Just at most a couple dozen or maybe a couple hundred people live in a precinct, and you can look at the precinct results of an election to see how homogenous the vote is there, right? And so there are a lot of places in this country where precinct level results were 75-25 for one of the two candidates. And that just means that 3/4 of the people that live in this very small neighborhood all voted for the same candidate. And it's very easy then to presuppose that they all understand each other and share the same values and know each other. And, and probably that 25% doesn't spend a lot of time advertising that they're big Biden or Trump supporters in that group of the 75% that voted for the other guy, right? So we really can see, and there's great analysis done that I mentioned in the book that actually looked at the extent to which people live near people from the other party in American cities. And it's just even in places that are fairly purple, there are huge red-blue divides in specific neighborhoods and precincts. That's just sort of, to your point about the geographic sorting, that's how America is constructed at this point.
So the data might indicate that my wish or myopia, my own myopia, is it has gone astray. So you do address the so-called culture wars. And by the way, I was surprised to learn that expression only dates back to the early 90s. It seems like it's been around my whole life. But I did want to get your thoughts on this. It seems to me that the culture wars mentality makes it out as if we're all locked in a very binary battle with sides being very distinct, and all sides being very orthodox to their own quote unquote side.
Mm-hmm.
But, and again, this is where my own myopia comes in. I thought we're a lot more diverse, especially on an individual basis, on an individual issue basis,
Sure.
diverse in terms of what sets of views I might have. But am I wrong about that? Am I myopic about that? Or is it really as binary as the culture wars, as Tucker Carlson would have us believe?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, it's not. I mean, look, one of the things I always say in interviews like this is you and I pay a lot more attention to this stuff than the average person, right? Like most people don't spend a lot of time worrying about politics. They don't really, they pay attention to who's running for president. They probably know who their senators are, right? They may know who the representatives are, but they worry about that mostly in election years. And again, I don't mean to sound patronizing. I mean, God, I'm jealous.
You're making
right?
the case why at least 100 million out of the 330 million need to read your book.
Oh, well, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But, I mean, look, it is easy for us to put people into buckets in part because American politics is structured around this or that, right? And so if you have views that don't fit into this, then you must be part of that. Or
right.
And, there is a very real and documented effect of when a group of people who share political views start to hold another view that other people sort of start to aggregate around that view as well. And one of the reasons we have political parties, obviously, is so that we don't all have to like sit down and think, well, what does it mean to increase military spending? Like, I don't know. Like, I am not, I'm going to defer to the experts on how much we should be spending on the military because that's not my wheelhouse. And one of the reasons that political parties exist is to provide a sort of consensus answer from people who agree with us on most other things about what these things should look like. And so that's one of the reasons we tend to sort of align with the rest of the people in the party. But then, of course, we've seen this big backlash. So we live in this era, as Julia Azari, the political scientist, says, of very, very strong partisanship, but very weak very, very strong partisanship and very weak parties, right? So we see most Americans, the plurality of Americans are independents, and they are not registered as Democrats or Republicans. They tend to vote either Democratic or Republican. They tend to be very skeptical of the parties. And these are people who often don't feel as though they fit within the stricture of the party, even if they generally agree with the party, even if they generally agree with the party's positions. Perhaps they do go sideways on something like abortion, or they go sideways on something, something else of importance to one of the political parties. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that people, don't spend a lot of time doing a lot of self-assessment in terms of what they believe about complicated political issues because it's not important to them, and they just, that's not how they live their lives, and God bless them for that. But B, I think that we are seeing this era of politics in America where people aren't willing to sign up for one of the two parties, and they want to show that they do not, adhere within the boundaries of the parties, even if they end up voting with the parties anyway.
Yeah. So kind of stepping away a little bit less specifically from politics and more looking sociologically, economically, I've really appreciated the last third or so of the book where you're dealing with trying to look out ahead, albeit with humility, knowing that there's as you discussed, there's certain knowns, unknowns, and a lot of unknowns. So to the degree that you can, who will inherit the economic boom?
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating question, and this is not my area of expertise, and so it's very interesting to talk to. I read a lot about politics. I read a little bit about economics, but not to the same extent. So it's very interesting to talk to a lot of people who are really, really detailed in this. And I had some good interviews that, like, I very much was like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'm going to pay close attention, listen to this a few times. But essentially, here's what we've got. We have this baby boom generation. They're getting older. They're starting to retire, as I mentioned. Most retirees at this point are baby boomers. And we are seeing that these baby boomers have a lot of wealth. They don't necessarily have it on an individual basis. There is huge wealth inequality in the United States. And so we have a lot of very, very rich baby boomers. We have a lot of less rich baby boomers who are very much, I think that group tends to drive a lot of the backlash against this perception of baby boomers as rich because they themselves aren't rich, and they understand, that we're talking about a subset of the boom. But there's a lot of money in the boom, and that there is going to be a huge transfer of wealth. Necessarily, that's what happens. People die, and people, people start making gifts to charities or to family members even before they die. And there's this big transfer of wealth that happens as people reach the end of their lives. I spoke with people who do these sorts of assessments. We're talking trillions of dollars that's going to change hands here. But the question is, we don't know the time period over which that's going to happen, right? And so we have, yes, baby boomers are older, reaching retirement age, but it's not like you die at the age of 70. Thankfully, right?
Yeah,
it's not as though we have a hard stop. We don't know when that's going to happen, and so there are a lot of things now that introduce uncertainty as to how much money will be passed on. How long do people live? Right? If people start living to be 95 years old, they're going to draw down a lot of the wealth that they have. They're going to sell their houses. They're going to go to assisted living. They're going to go to senior housing. They're going to be spending a lot more money on medical care and self-care over the course of the end of their lives, the longer they live, right? What does it look like in terms of their housing? When do you sell your house? Do you want to live in your house the rest of your lives? Is someone going to buy your house? Is there going to be demand for the sorts of house that baby boomers want to live in? And there's a real question. Do millennials and Gen Zers, do they want to live in a big house in the suburbs?
In the villages.
Yeah, right. Do they want to live in the villages? Right. I mean, the villages isn't that big, so I think they'll probably find space. But will those people be able to sell their houses, or will they be able to sell them for as much as they assume they would be able to sell them at? And will they have a sudden medical emergency? I tell the story in the book. I'm not the first to, but of the gentleman who won the Nobel Prize and then was struck with Alzheimer's, and he had no choice, but he had these medical bills, and he had to sell his Nobel Prize in order to be. It's just like, these sorts of tragic situations arise, and I don't mean to be a pessimist, but that shapes what the wealth distribution looks like, who it goes to, and how much there is to pass on. I think the fundamental, the one assumption I would draw is that rich Americans are going to pass on more wealth to their richer kids, just by virtue of how the system works. And everyone that I spoke with pointed to wealth inequality as a fundamental factor to a lot of this. But we see even now that younger Americans are not as wealthy as their parents were at the same age. And so we see the way in which wealth is accrued at the top, the upper generational levels of American society, but we don't know what it looks like when that starts coming back down.
So talked a lot about the economic side of it and touched upon some of the other patterns, but what other patterns can we reasonably expect to emerge as boomers continue to age?
Well, I think that one of the fascinating things, and one of the things that I spent a lot of time looking at in the book, is this consideration of race in America, right? And this isn't necessarily just about boomers as they age, but it's about the period during which boomers are going to age, right? The baby boomers are going to be around for decades to come. Again, the youngest boomers were born in 1964, so we're talking about less than 60 years old at this point in time. So there are going to be boomers around for a while, and over the course of this period, then America's going to continue to transition to this younger group of people, a more heavily non-white group of people. And that has inspired some of the backlash that we've seen over the course of the past several years, decade or so in American politics. But one of the fascinating aspects, and I'm just sort of jumping ahead here a little bit, but one of the fascinating aspects is that those assumptions about the demography of the United States are rooted in an assumption that people who identify as a particular race or ethnic group now will continue to do so in the future. That people who are now say, hey, I'm Hispanic, their kids will be Hispanic, and their kids will be Hispanic. And so the density of Hispanics in American culture will get much heavier. And as a result, that whites will become a minority. And that's inspiring a lot of people to be really freaked out about how America is changing. But that assumption is not necessarily accurate. And that people in the future, the children of Hispanics may not identify as Hispanics, particularly as we get to this much more heavily multiracial society, in which the Census Bureau says, if you have a Hispanic mother and a white father, that your kids are going to be Hispanic. Well, I'm white and my wife is half Hispanic and Native American, and I don't know how our kids are going to identify themselves, right? And so there are these assumptions that are made about demography, which have very real effects in the moment. It's likely that white Americans, non-Hispanic whites, will be a minority in America over the course of the next decade or two. But it's not a certainty, and it depends on how people self-identify, and depends on how the Census Bureau measures that. But there's a lot of reaction. We see a lot of actual hard reaction, particularly among older generation Americans, to the idea that whites are going to become a minority, in the same way that we see reactions to the fact that the density of Christians is declining in the United States. We see these reactions that are based, in this case, on something that isn't necessarily going to be accurate or manifest at the speed that the Census Bureau has said. And that could have very real implications for how we prepare for what America looks like and the decisions we're making now, and the backlash, the political backlash we've already seen over the course of the past decade.
Yeah. And you deal with a lot of that in the book. I love some of the really on point questions that you ask. Are there enough young people to support older people?
Yeah, right. Another key question. Sure.
Yeah. So I have a few more questions. I want to go back to kind of the beginning. So you started out as a designer at Adobe, and you end up as this really prolific writer, author, multiple columns on a daily basis for the Washington Post. How did you get from Adobe designer to prolific writer for the Washington Post?
Okay, so the through line, and I've done enough self-reflection, I think I can summarize this. The through line is sort of data and systems analysis. And that may not sound very logical, but so I began in about 2001. It started in college. I was in college at Ohio State. I worked at a computer lab. The computer lab used to be a thing, which I realized when I was at Ohio State a couple of years ago, like they don't have that anymore because everyone has their own computers. But when you probably, and when I was in college, there was a lab. You go to a big room, and if you didn't have a computer, you sat down and used a computer in that room. And I worked at a lab from midnight to 8 a.m. And this was right when the web was emerging. And so I taught myself how to do basic HTML pages and learned how to do that. And that eventually, because I taught myself how to do that and how to do basic coding, that ended up getting me the job at Adobe. And at Adobe, as I said, my job was to teach people how to use the products. And so there was a lot of breaking things down, understanding them, and then presenting that back to people. And so I kept on the side. I had my own personal blog, and I was sort of assessing the news and doing charts for the news. I worked at Adobe. Eventually, I ended up working in the labor movement and working in California for an extended period of time. I worked on political campaigns and got to, the same thing. Political campaigns are about putting together the proper number of numbers you need in order to win an election, right? And so it is data analysis, is figuring out what you need and then putting it together and getting the numbers. And so then I ended up doing consulting for a brief period of time, but I realized that what I really wanted to do was I wanted to do this sort of analysis. And so I started writing for the web, but that was the continuing theme. It was a thing happens. What are the numbers that undergird that? What's the information that undergirds that? How, if it's complex, how do we pick apart that complexity and present it to people in a way they can understand? And it just happens to be something that I'm good at. And so that's where it landed.
So my other question, kind of on the personal side, is, just clearly by the number of references you have in the book, it's clear that you're a great researcher, but are you as voracious of a reader as it seems? And if so, who are you reading? What are you reading right now?
It's funny because I'm not, right? And I'm sort of embarrassed to say that, but I spend so much time dealing in the day-to-day news, like for my job. I spend a lot of time on social media. I read a lot of news articles, but I don't actually have a lot of time to actually sit and read. That's not true. Everyone has a lot of time to sit and read if they choose to do so. Yeah. I end up, I also have a kid who's 6 and a kid who's 3.
So you're reading Goodnight Moon. That's your recommendation.
Yes, absolutely. I could tell you all about Elephant and Piggy in the whole gang. So I don't, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that. Yeah, I have the most recent book I've read is The Aftermath by Philip Bump. I also haven't written it, but I tend to, in my downtime, I tend to watch movies and things like that. So I am embarrassed to admit that.
Well, there's some great content on TV. You can access good streaming shows, great movies. So trying to educate my kids on some great cinema. Got to go watch. Yeah. Godfather 1, Godfather 2, Raging Bull.
Yeah, my kids are a little young for the Godfather.
A little young for Raging Bull? Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
All right, so do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, tell me what do you find to be the most useful way of cutting through? My job on a day-to-day basis is understanding, the way in which different political groups represent themselves and the tensions between them. What do you find is actually the best way to cut through that? And this is your podcast is predicated on this idea. Like, how do you find what's successful? What works?
So it's a great question, and I'm learning part of the project is I need to learn myself. I'm not really good at it, and I'm trying to get better at it. I've come across some really great people, some great organizations, and just here recently in the last season, I've become really good friends with the folks at the Village Square. It started in Tallahassee. Now it's a national nonprofit organization, and through the Village Square, just recently I met a incredible journalist, Monica Guzman. And she's affiliated now with an organization called Braver Angels. Her recent book, I think, really distills and resonated with a lot of what I've been learning over the last 2 years. And, not to oversimplify it, but her book is about, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. And in fact, if off the top of my head, I think that's the name of her book. I never thought of it that way. So, being radically curious, our tendency, including mine, and I catch myself literally on a daily basis doing this, having the comeback for something like when my nice acquaintance, a business acquaintance, told me, well, 81 million, obviously 81 million didn't buy. And I had all these comebacks for her, and that just wasn't I think a more effective way is to, that's interesting. Why do you feel that way? And because what it does is, and I've been modestly successful here and there with that approach. What it does is it is one step or one rung up a ladder, if you will, to a relationship. And if I nurture a relationship, it gives me a little bit more fertile ground to have some persuasion. If I do push back at a certain point, it's not just on petty, trivial things. Then it has more weight if I do push back, or if I offer a different perspective. I've earned that right by being more of a listener and a curious, friendly dialogue partner. So, there's lots of other things, but that book, again, really resonated with some of the things that I was learning along the way. And the other thing too is, if we're looking to change someone's perspective 180 degrees in one conversation, we're going to be endlessly frustrated. But if we're looking to maybe have 1 degree of influence, 1 degree of persuasion, that, from one conversation, I think there's a lot more opportunity for that, especially if we enter into it with the possibility that we might be persuaded about something as well, or at least better understand their point of view. So those are some of the things that I've been learning along the way. But again, I'm the worst student in the class, so trying to get my F up to a D+.
I have a great anecdote for you that is along the lines of what you just said. So in 2009, I was living in New York City, and I got called for jury duty. And I was just doing contract work at the time, and I had a contract to end. And so they were like, well, we're looking for people who can sit on a jury that might last a month or two. And I was like, you know what? I have never been on jury duty. I'm intrigued. I'll do it. So the case ended up being, so I don't know how familiar you are with New York, but you've heard of it.
Yeah, I kind of grew up there. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. So Brooke Astor, a denizen of the New York social scene for decades, inherited the Astor family fortune from, the Waldorf Astoria and Astor Square and so on and so forth. Her son was accused of having taken advantage of her dementia and stolen money from her. And so I ended up serving as a juror on this case that lasted 6 months over the course of 2009. And, just this wide galaxy of New York social, giants who came and served as witnesses. Henry Kissinger sat in a witness box. Barbara Walters sat in a witness box. Annette de Laurenta. And eventually, after seeing 6 months of testimony and evidence, the jury was tasked with going back and issuing a verdict. And so we all went back into the jury room. And I, being me and being this person who always feels confident that he's got things figured out, and, often does not, went into the jury room. I was like, okay, we all saw that, we weren't allowed to talk about the evidence prior to that point, because that's how it works in a jury. And so I walk in the jury room and I'm feeling, okay, like, obviously everyone saw the same thing I did. We're all going to reach the same conclusion. And it's very quickly disabused of that. And we disagreed on a wide range of things. But one of the things that emerged over the course of that time in the jury room was that we had one juror in particular who was simply not moved by logical argument, right? That was not what motivated her. And, I realized in the moment that For people who are motivated by passion, you can't logic them to your same conclusion, right? And so we ended up having to, because all of the 11 rest of us were in agreement on these key charges. She was not. And we sort of had to figure out, how do we get her to that place? And we had to have a different sort of relationship with her. And we couldn't just simply say, well, don't you remember when they had the evidence on this day? We couldn't do that. We had to be like, what do you think? And how's it going? And it really was very, very informative to me to understand in this really high stakes, a very important issue, right? This is not, and it really was like there's this microcosm. You don't usually get placed into a situation where you and a small group of people have to come up with a very important decision on something. But it really forced us to do that and to understand her and where she was coming from. And eventually we reached a unanimous verdict. And it was just, I remember that moment and just being sort of flabbergasted, like, oh my God, everyone saw this totally differently than I did. And we're not going to be able to, this is not, I assumed it would be done in 10 minutes. And that was not how it shaped it.
Yeah. The lens through which we see can be very, very different. So before we go, how can we find you, more information about the new book, The Aftermath, and all the great work that you're doing?
Sure. Easiest way is pbump.com, pbump.com. That's, got all the stuff about the book. That's also my Twitter handle. If you're interested, or go to the Washington Post, just do a search for Philip Bump. There aren't too many of those in the world, and that'll come right up.
Philip Bump, Philip with one L, mind you.
That's it.
And I'll be tagging Philip Bump and the book and all that throughout the coming week. And I appreciate you coming in. There's a great conversation. Nice. It's so cool. I found so much of the book and your work for years now to be really, really fascinating. That's so great. It's a real treat for me to get to talk to you directly.
Of course. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about talking politics and religion without killing each other. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials, at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us, by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.